So, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Maya Schonbach. I'm a clinical psychologist and the clinical program director here at Stop OCD. Today, we're going to be talking about OCD's really scariest thoughts and the core fears, and really kind of the tagline, I guess, is Am I going crazy? Something that is really, really common to people dealing with OCD. So, today's webinar is about 45 minutes. I really, really encourage you guys to ask questions or share any comments or thoughts that you have in the chat, and then we'll go over everything all together at the end, and we'll do a Q&A. And also, I really suggest that you guys stick around because there'll be a promo code at the end of the presentation to subscribe to our program for $100 off. So definitely stick around for that. So let's get started. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about am I going crazy? So really the idea of when OCD makes you question your sanity. We'll talk about why these fears and why these intrusive thoughts, the core fears feel so convincing. We'll talk specifically about core fears and what they are. So really the feared consequence beneath the intrusive thoughts or the obsessions. And then we'll talk a lot about treatment because I think that's really, really important. A lot of people always ask about how we work at Stop OCD, and like what are some of the tools that they can use. And so we'll talk about how ERP, and that's really the gold standard of treatment for OCD. And we'll talk about how ERP helps you respond differently, specifically to these core fears underlying the obsessional thoughts. We'll conclude everything together. And like I said, we'll do the Q&A. So let's start off with when OCD makes you question your sanity. So really one of the cruelest things that OCD can do is make people question their sanity, their own mind. Not just think, why did I have that thought? But think, what if this means that I'm losing it? If I can't trust myself, am I going crazy? What if having this thought means something is seriously wrong with me, if I'm dangerous? So for a lot of people, that's really the part that feels the most frightening. So it's not just the content of the thought, it's really the fear that the thought says something terrible about their sanity, about their lack of control, their morality, or about really who they are. And people can start wondering whether they're dangerous, whether they're secretly capable of doing something awful, whether they're going crazy, or whether really they can trust their own mind. And so from the outside, sometimes it can look like a person is maybe overreacting to some thought. But really, when the person with OCD it feels so much more serious than that. Because it can feel like the thought is maybe something like a warning or maybe evidence, or it's the start of some sort of collapse. And so, really, this is part of the reason why OCD can be so confusing. So, by definition, OCD involves obsessions. First, that's the O. And the obsessions are intrusive thoughts that create significant distress. And compulsions, the C in the OCD, the compulsions are meant to reduce their behaviors or mental events that are meant to reduce that distress or prevent some feared consequence by doing them. So, in other words, the compulsions or the rituals, they're not random, even though down the road they might seem random. But initially, they're not random. They're an attempt to feel safe, to maybe get some certainty. That's also a big key thing in OCD is the idea of certainty or lack of certainty. And the compulsions are also meant to stop something terrible from happening. So it could be anything from checking, reviewing, avoidance behaviors, reassurance seeking, or reassuring yourself. That doesn't automatically mean that the person is losing touch with reality. Often, it means that the person is caught in this fear-based obsessive compulsive cycle or loop, and they're desperately trying to feel safe and certain again. So in OCD, questioning your sanity is often really part of the disorder itself because the thought, the intrusive thought feels threatening. But the panic comes from the meaning attached to the thought, not from the actual loss of control. It's the meaning that feels catastrophic. And then the mind starts to try to solve it. So, really, if OCD's ever made you ask yourself if you're going crazy, that really you're not alone in that. It's really one of the ways that OCD attacks a person's sense of safety right in their own mind. Very tricky, this OCD. So, OCD usually doesn't latch onto things that feel neutral, okay? It tends to go after things that feel important to the person, that feel personal, that are like high stakes. And really, that's why OCD so often shows up around things like danger, morality, harm, um, relationships, identity, religion, health, and essentially loss of control. These are things that carry a lot of emotional weight. So if someone has an intrusive thought like, what if I hurt someone? Or what if I'm a bad person? Or what if this means something terrible about me? The thought, it feels so kind of sticky, that's what we say, because it touches something really deeply important. And then it makes the whole experience feel extremely personal. And so people often think, why this thought or why this fear? And one way we can think about it is that OCD tends to target what feels most loaded. So, in that sense, we can say the content isn't always random. It can reflect areas where a person feels especially vulnerable or responsible. So it could be it's often personal in that sense. Um, and that's important because often people with OCD often assume that it's the opposite. They assume that if the content of the thought is so upsetting, it must reveal something horrible or dark or something true about them. But really, it's not the content of the thought. Really, what makes the thought so upsetting is that the thought, it goes against who they are, what they value, really, or who they most want to protect. So really, what we can say is what OCD targets often is more about what matters to you than about who you are. That's really important. So if somebody has a question about that, definitely write it into the chat because that's an important distinction there. Okay, so let's talk about why these fears feel so convincing. Okay, so what makes OCD so hard isn't just the intrusive thought itself. It's really what the way that the thought, sorry, the obsession makes you feel. The OCD creates more than a thought because these thoughts often come with doubt, urgency, really strong emotional charge. So instead of feeling like random mental noise, these thoughts feel important. They feel dangerous. They feel like something that you need to deal with immediately. And that's why people often say things like, it didn't just feel like a thought, or I felt like I had to figure it out right now. And that's really the trap. OCD really makes emotional intensity. It makes the thoughts start to feel meaningful and makes the emotional intensity feel kind of like evidence. And if the thought feels disturbing enough, then the mind starts to treat it as meaningful, right? You'll start to think, why did I have that thought? What if this says something bad about me? What if I shouldn't ignore it? But really, what's important to say is that a thought can feel powerful without being informative, right? Emotional intensity can be mistaken for truth. It doesn't have to be truthful. Um, And so especially in OCD where we have these compulsive behaviors that are meant to provide relief and reduce distress, um, the thoughts can generate this urgency without actually needing a response. But that's where people often get stuck. They're not reacting to the content of the thought, they're reacting to the feeling that arises because they think that the thought must mean something about them. Okay, so OCD then amplifies the fear. It's not just creating the fear, it then also turns up the dial. So, um, what I mean by amplifying it is that the thought starts to really feel like a problem that needs to be solved right now. So the person starts to do things to get relief, which, like I said, they're compulsion. So it could be things like checking behaviors, checking the stove, checking the electric appliances, avoidance behaviors, asking others for reassurance, confessing things, mental compulsions, mentally reviewing things, analyzing things, trying to figure out maybe what the thought really means, switching a thought with another thought. All of those are compulsions. And these different responses, they're helpful in the moment, right? Because what they do is they bring down the anxiety for a short while. But in the long term, they keep the cycle going. And that's really one of the central things that maintains OCD because the relief is real. And once the relief is real, the brain learns from it, but it's short lived. So the brain learns, okay, good, great. We took that thought seriously. Good thing we did something about it. Good thing we did that compulsion. We feel better. That really means that there must have been something dangerous with that thought. So the next time the fear shows up, it's going to come back stronger, faster, harder, more urgently. And so you really can think of this as the brain's alarm system becoming reinforced again and again by compulsions so that more and more situations start to feel like threats. And really, that's why OCD can start to feel bigger over time because a single fear turns into a whole system of rituals, of avoidance behaviors, mental compulsions. And then the person ends up trapped not only by the original obsession, but by all of the different things that they've started doing to feel some illusion of safety from that initial obsession. And so when we say that OCD amplifies, turns up the fear, what we're really talking about is this loop, right? It's that this scary thought shows up. The person feels driven to respond. The response brings this temporary relief. The temporary relief strengthens the fear. And again, this is really why and the cycle gets stronger over time. And so that's why with treatment, we don't focus only on the thought, we focus on the entire cycle. Sorry. My dog wanted to go outside. Sorry. Okay, so a lot of our clients like to hear about research in neurobiology. So I'm presenting this information from a recent paper from 2023 from Jalal and colleagues. And they write about that some of the main ideas in current OCD research is that OCD is linked to dysfunction in areas that we call the cortico-striato-thalamocortical circuits. Easier to say, CSTC circuits, okay, in the brain. And these are things that are involved in things like emotion, reward processing, executive control, response inhibition, and habit-based behavior. So when these loops are dysregulated or not working smoothly, the brain can have trouble doing a few important things. It can have difficulty shifting away from certain thoughts, difficulty inhibiting repetitive responses, and then also updating behavior in a flexible way. And all of those things fit really well with kind of the lived experience of OCD. So really what happens is, like I said, the thought comes in, and instead of it just fading into the background, the white noise of our brain, it feels really important. The fear gets triggered, and then instead of settling down the fear, it keeps looping. You start the ritual, and then instead of feeling optional, it begins to feel like a habit that's hard to stop. And research also talks about OCD involving problems in things like cognitive flexibility. That's also important. Response inhibition, visual spatial memory, goal-directed behavior, um, and links those difficulties back to abnormal activity in these same circuits. And then another important point that the research shows is that OCD may have, like I said, um, a shift towards habit-based behavior, right? So, in simple terms, they said in the paper is that some compulsions may stop feeling like a choice that you're making deliberately in order to reduce the panic and the distress, and they start to feel like a more rigid, habitual, learned response pattern that's really, really hard to interrupt. And like hard to shut off. And they also wrote in the paper about several different neurochemical systems that may be involved in these loops. So they talked about serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate. Um, but the research is still not 100% settled on these different systems. So I take that with a grain of salt. But really, the big takeaway with all of this is that there's not one single kind of OCD center in the brain, right? It's more like a network problem. There's circuits that are involved in threat, in control, inhibition, habits that are just not regulating in a smooth way. And that really helps explain why the intrusive thoughts are so sticky. Like I said, the compulsions, the urges, they feel so urgent. And then that's why the compulsions feel so difficult to resist. But again, that doesn't mean that the feared thought is true, but it helps explain why it feels so compelling, so important. Okay, so now let's talk about core fears. So when we look at OCD, like we said, the obsession on the surface that we see isn't often isn't really the whole story. Underneath it is usually a deeper feared consequence. Really what the person is afraid that this thought could lead to, could reveal about them or about other things, or really what it means in the worst case scenario. That's really what we mean by a core fear. So on the surface, the intrusive thought might be, what if I contaminated something? But the feared consequence, the core fear underneath might be, okay, what if I contaminated something, but what if someone gets sick because of me? What if I'm responsible for serious harm? That's another one. What if I could never forgive myself? Okay, so that's all for the same intrusive thought. Or the surface, again, obsession on the surface could be, what if I'm not sure enough about my relationship? But underneath it could be, the core fear could be, what if I ruin my life? What if I make the wrong choice and there's no fixing it? Or it could be, what if I end up alone? So really, it's that deeper feared consequence that really is often what gives the obsession on the surface so much force. And it's really what drives a lot of the rituals. Like I said, the checking, the compulsions, the checking, the avoidance behaviors, the mental compulsions. So really, the core fear is the feared consequences that drive the obsessional fears and the compulsions that follow. And this is why, this is very important, and we'll talk about this some more, but this is why OCD can look different on the outside, but still be organized around the same deeper fear underneath. And also, someone's theme might change over time, right? The rituals could change, but underneath it could be this deeper threat that OCD keeps pointing to. And that part, that core fear could stay surprisingly consistent. Could be about being a bad person, causing harm. We'll talk about some example, the common core fears next. But essentially, when your therapist asks, what's the core fear here? What we're really asking is, what is OCD saying that would be so terrible if this were true? And then really, this is really an important question in treatment and therapy, because once we can identify this feared consequence, then we can start to map out the whole pattern in general, and then start to treat it as a pattern. Okay, so like I said, we will talk about some common core fears. So like we said, underneath the surface of obsessions, there's some common patterns that tend to show up. Again, not because everyone with OCD is the same, not by any means, and not because people fit into neat categories or anything, but often as humans and with OCD, we circle around a number of really deeply painful possibilities. So for some people, the core fear is being a bad person. So this can show up in, again, a variety of types of OCD. So for example, harm OCD, maybe sexual intrusive thoughts, scrupulosity OCD, moral obsessions, right? So the fear isn't just about being a bad person. What if I had this thought? The core fear underneath it is, what if this means something terrible about me? I'm a bad person. For some people, the core fear is about causing harm, sometimes even death. And so, again, this can show up in contamination OCD, OCD with checking compulsions, health-related fears, fears of making mistakes. And really, the deeper core fear here is, what if someone gets hurt because of me? For others, the core fear is ruining their life beyond repair. Like we said, it could show up in relationship OCD, fears about identity. So it's really, again, not just about uncertainty. It's about fear of making the wrong move and then living with these irreversible consequences and ruining your life beyond repair. Another common one is about ending up alone or abandoned or cut off from loved ones. So here, this is very common in relationship OCD, things having to do with attachment and rejection. And really underneath that is the fear of being left, being rejected, being fundamentally alone. And then finally, common core fear is about being condemned, being exposed, or feeling out of control. And like we said at the beginning, the fear of going crazy, fear of being found out, fear of eternal punishment often in scrupulosity OCD, fear of losing control in some catastrophic way. And again, these aren't meant to be like rigid categories or boxes, and a person also can have more than one. But sometimes it's important just to really slow down and ask really what feels the most unbearable, and then that's how you get a clearer picture of your core fear. But like I said, it's important for therapy to have a few of these kind of patterns in mind, because then it also helps you move from asking, okay, what's wrong with me, to asking, what is the OCD actually threatening me with here? And then that can make you understand your experience a lot better. Okay, so the same theme can mean different things. So another one of the reasons that core fears matter so much is that two people can have OCD that looks very similar on the outside, but be terrified of very different things underneath, right? So for contamination OCD, for example, so two people might avoid public bathrooms, wash their hands repeatedly. That's funny. and feel very intense distress about germs. So on the surface, presenting the same way. But for one person, the feared consequence might be, what if I get seriously sick? Okay. And for another person, it might be, what if I contaminate someone else and it's my fault? Okay. And then another totally different person could be, what if this contamination proves that I'm careless, I'm irresponsible, I'm dangerous, right? Something about that I'm a bad person, essentially. So really, like I said, this is the same theme, the same type of OCD, but they have very different core fears underneath. Let's do another example with relationship OCD. So two people may both obsess about whether or not they have the right partner. They're within the right partner within their relationship. For one person, the core fear could be, what if I ruin my life by making the wrong choice? Another one could be, what if I end up completely alone? And then another one could be, what if I never really know myself and I live the wrong life? So see that this is, again, the same idea, that the similar obsessions and then the feared consequence, the core fear underneath, is very different. And so really, this is why it's so important that OCD treatment is individualized. Because if we only look at the theme on the surface of contamination, of harm, of relationships, of morality, then we can totally miss what's actually driving all of the distress and all of the compulsions. So when we talk about core fears, we're not over analyzing the thoughts, okay? What we're trying to do is understand what makes this particular obsession feel so intense and loaded for this particular person. And really that makes us get a better sense of the person, of their OCD, and of their compulsions and rituals. And so it's important for a treatment to really target it more, to target this directly, because we're not asking really what is the theme, what is the obsession. We're asking what makes it so terrifying, what makes these intrusive thoughts so unbearable for this person. Okay, so like I said, just in summary, kind of, identifying the core fear really matters because it helps us understand what the OCD is really organized around. So, like I said, the OCD can look totally different on the surface. And a person could have many different obsessions, different rituals, lots of different triggers. But again, often the different symptoms all circle around the same feared consequence. And if we don't understand the core fear, the feared consequence, then treatment can stay too surface level. And really, this was important for me to say, is that a highly cited OCD paper really stated that failing to address the core fear as it really is a common pitfall in treatment. Because they say if you only work on the visible symptom and you never get to the feared consequence underneath, then they show that progress can be slower, and symptoms really shift in like shift form. You can change obsessions, you can change compulsions, rather than truly loosening and creating a true shift. So this is real treatment value here. And so once we know the feared consequence, treatment, like I said, can be much more focused. And then that takes us to treatment in the sense of exposure, because we're not going to expose a person to a trigger in a generic way. We're going to help the person face what their OCD is saying would be so terrible, and then help them to resist all the rituals that they built around that fear. So that's what I'm saying. So that the feared consequence needs to be addressed directly in order to make the treatment more accurate for that specific person. So with that, let's talk about treatment. And again, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat or comments. Okay, so like I said, once we've identified the fear consequence or the core fear underneath the obsessions, we can understand the treatment in a really much more focused way. And like I said at the beginning, the recommended treatment for OCD is ERP, which stands for exposure and response prevention. So here, exposure means really gradually, intentionally approaching the things that trigger the obsessional distress, the distress that arises from the intrusive thoughts. And then response prevention means resisting the compulsions that usually follow. Um, and those could be, like I said, they could be visual things like checking behaviors or washing, or they could be more internal or mental, like reviewing things, trying to get certainty, switching thoughts with another one, reassurance seeking. Um, and so in ERP, it's important to say that we're not only exposing ourselves to the trigger itself, we're using the trigger to help the person face the underlying emotion and the core fear beneath it. Okay? So at a basic level, ERP really helps people learn something really important, that anxiety, uncertainty, urges, they rise. It's like a wave, they rise and they fall without needing to be solved through rituals. And that's really a central way that ERP works. And another way that's important, another point that's important here, like I said, is that if ERP focuses only on the surface trigger and never gets to the core fear underneath, like I said before, that the treatment can stay too kind of shallow. So for example, if someone has contamination OCD, ERP isn't really only about touching something dirty. It's about facing whatever that person's OCD is saying that touching something dirty means. So again, it could mean different things to different people. Maybe that they could get sick. Maybe they could be responsible for somebody else being sick. Maybe I'd have to live with uncertainty and guilt, right? And so that's why ERP is so good, because it works at two levels at the same time. It targets both the trigger and the feared consequence underneath it at the same time. Um, and so really, ERP isn't about proving that nothing bad could ever happen, right? Because we live in a world, there's no certainty. But it's about building willingness to face what your OCD is telling you is so unbearable without doing all of the compulsive behaviors and rituals that keep that fear and distress alive in that OCD loop that we talked about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how ERP reaches the real fear. So again, sometimes people hear about ERP and just think it's about touching the feared object or going into the situation or just stopping the ritual. And again, that's part of it. But we don't want to just stop there. We don't want to miss what actually gives the obsession its power, right? So good ERP has to reach the core fear. And so sometimes that means doing what we call in vivo exposures, so real life exposures that really bring the person in contact not only with, again, the trigger itself, but with the feared emotion and the core fear underneath it. So, for example, like I said, with contamination OCD, they could be touching something that feels contaminated in real life in order to maybe face the uncertainty or the guilt or the fear of feeling responsible or being sick. Um, and but sometimes the feared consequence is much harder to reach in a direct way, right? It could be extremely catastrophic. It could be distant, impossible, hard to test. So for example, what if this means I'll become a dangerous person, right? What if I go to hell? We don't know. Like, how can we test that? What if I ruin my child's life? Again, how can we test that? What if I could never trust myself again? It's kind of vague. And so that's where an interesting type of exposure comes in, and that's called imaginal exposure. And so in imaginal exposure, we're not going to talk about this too much, but imaginal exposure, essentially, you work with a therapist on writing a script about your worst case scenario. Um, and you practice and you make it very, very rich with a lot of description and sensory work. And you practice reading it to yourself, listening to yourself, reading it, and really, really imagining this core fear coming true. And then again, it's the idea that you expose yourself to the emotions and the core fear from that trigger. So research really shows that imaginal exposure is specifically useful when the feared consequence feels catastrophic, distant, hard to test. And then also interestingly is that you can combine these in vivo, these real life exposures and imaginal exposure. So the person also stays, it can face a trigger while also staying in contact with the core fear underneath. So for example, you could be touching something contaminated and then at the same time, maybe reading a script all about making a loved one sick and feeling guilty and da 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 da. So, really, again, I just want to hammer home the idea that ERP works best when you dig down and you really make contact with the person's core fear. Because again, that's what the rituals are organized around, and the distress and all of the urgency from the intrusive thoughts. And that's what we need to really face. Again, so the main idea is, in summary, is that ERP really isn't only about facing the trigger, it's about learning to stay with the guilt, with the shame, with the uncertainty, the fear, the vulnerability that really the trigger brings up without doing the ritual. And then over time, the person learns something new, that they can feel uncertainty and they don't need to solve it. They can feel shame without needing to neutralize it. They can feel the urge to get certainty and to not obey it, to not succumb to the urge. And so when we talk about recovery with OCD, it means really realizing that these feelings, these emotions can be there, and you don't need to fix them or to neutralize them or to get certainty right away by ritualizing, by doing compulsions. You can accept that they can be there. So I want to talk just a little bit about response prevention because we kind of focus more on the exposure part. So response prevention is very important. And essentially what it means is not doing what the OCD is pushing you to do. So again, sometimes that's obvious, like the visible rituals, like washing or checking, or asking for reassurance. But often the rituals are more internal, mental rituals. So not trying to prove your thought wrong or not saying something to yourself to make yourself feel safe, things like that. And research really shows that mental compulsions are very easily missed with especially by therapists that aren't in your head and we don't know what's going on. So it's really important to be to learn about these mental rituals and then to be able to talk about them openly. And so really research shows that these mental compulsions, if they are left untreated, they keep OCD going just like visible rituals do. And reassurance seeking, same idea. So response prevention, it doesn't mean doing nothing. It really means that you notice the push that OCD is pushing you to do in order to get relief and then deciding not to do that behavior. It's really hard. It sounds really easy, but it's really, really hard. But every time the person resists that behavior, they really, again, teach the brain something new, that this feeling, this uncomfortable feeling can be there and that I don't have to neutralize it. And essentially, that's why relief is not the goal in the moment, right? Obviously, we want relief, but over time, the compulsions just keep the cycle going and to amplify the fear. So in exposure and response prevention, our goal really is to stop feeding the cycle. It's to be able to stay with the fear without neutralizing it and recognizing it that it can go down on its own without doing a compulsion. So one practical tool that I really want you guys to take away with you in order to actually access your feared consequence or the core fear is really it's called the downward arrow. And really it's very simple. The basic idea is to start with the obsession or the trigger and then ask yourself, what feels so bad about that? And then once you have an answer to that, you ask it again and again, and you just keep going kind of until you've reached your feared consequence. So okay, so let's say for example, that your obsession is, what if I made a mistake? So then you ask yourself, what feels so bad about that? Then you say, okay, someone could get hurt. And then you say, what feels so bad about that? And then you say, then it would be my fault. And then you say, what feels so bad about that? Then you say, maybe I'd never forgive myself. Okay, so then that's a lot closer to what ERP then needs to actually target. The fear that I'd never be able to forgive myself. That's a core fear. Or relationship OCD. Okay, so what if I'm not sure enough about my relationship? You say, what feels so bad about that? Then you say, I could make the wrong choice. What feels so bad about that? I could ruin my life. What feels so bad about that? I could end up alone, right? And then that I could end up alone is a core fear that's much more useful than the surface obsession of, okay, but what if I'm not sure about my relationship? And so again, like we said with ERP, it's much more useful for the exposures to target the core fear itself. So again, here we're not trying to endlessly ask what feels so bad about that in an obsessive way. We're really here trying to clarify what the OCD is threatening you with so that you can then build your exposure around that core fear rather than just around the surface kind of obsession. So in summary about treatment is really that recovery doesn't mean that the mind becomes perfectly quiet. Nobody's mind is perfectly quiet, unfortunately. Thoughts still show up, right? But what changes is your relationship to them. The thoughts feel less urgent, less important, less meaningful. They stop feeling maybe like emergencies, and then you don't get pulled into the OCD cycle every time, and you start to recognize what's happening earlier and earlier. And really, you start to realize that the OCD is trying to hook me in again. And then you're less likely to automatically obey it, and then less time doing compulsions, and really trying to essentially reach a feeling of certainty that is unattainable. And also, it means that when OCD themes change, which it often does, the person may be able to recognize the familiar pattern underneath, right? Because the content can be different, but the pattern could be similar. And then if you can recognize that, then you're able to respond in a calmer way. And essentially, recovery involves being more willing to feel things that used to seem unbearable, right? Things like uncertainty, guilt, vulnerability, shame, doubt, fear, and then without immediately turning to rituals in order to neutralize those feelings. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to like those feelings, but it means that you don't organize your entire life around trying to get rid of them. Okay, so really, it doesn't mean that the OCD disappears all at once, but treatment really helps you start to be able to see it and predict it, and it allows you some freedom and agency in not following it so rigidly. Okay, so let's go through some key takeaways. So first, OCD tends to really target what feels important, threatening, or deeply personal. And really that's why, part of the reason why the thoughts can feel so disturbing, because they touch the exact areas where people feel so vulnerable or responsible or afraid of getting something terribly wrong. Second, OCD makes those fears feel so convincing by adding urgency, doubt, and emotional intensity. And the problem isn't just the thought itself, it's really the sense that the thought means something that has to be solved immediately, and you really can't move on until you get that certainty. Third, underneath obsessions is core fear, which are the feared consequences that often really drive the rituals. And these could commonly be things like being a bad person, causing harm, ending up alone. And finally, ERP really helps by changing the person's relationship to really that whole cycle, right? We said it targets both the trigger and the core fear without performing rituals. And so again, that's really where change happens, not by figuring it out, but learning that the fear can be there without needing it or letting it run your life. Okay, so here are some free resources that we have. So you can look at some recordings of our past webinars on our YouTube page or on our website, stopocd.com. I really encourage you guys to follow us on social media. They're really good opportunities for community, and they're really good comprehensive center for information and for treatment options. And like I promised, here is the $100 discount for the first month. Use the promo code PROWEB100. And if you have any questions about our program, you can email support@stopocd.com. And if you have any clinical questions that you don't feel comfortable sharing here in the chat, you can email me at maya@helpingminds.com, and I would be happy to email with you. So I'll open up the chat now. Let's see if anybody has any questions. Somebody wrote, you mentioned for contamination, ERP should not be done on the surface level. Yes, I meant that it shouldn't just be about simply touching the contaminated object, but it also should be about working with the core fear underneath as well. So understanding if maybe the core fear of, for example, contamination OCD, if it is about getting sick yourself and then being able to stay with that fear while you're doing the exposure, or about feeling guilty and holding the responsibility of maybe making loved ones sick at the same time from contaminating things. So really understanding that and then digging down beneath the surface of the obsession. Wow, great question. How can I help my loved one that has OCD? So first of all, being here, learning about it, that's a really great first step. And if you look on our website, we actually stopocd.com, we actually have a blog post all about accommodation. And you could definitely look that up, that I wrote not too long ago. And that has some really good first kind of steps to help a loved one deal with OCD and really your part that you can do. They obviously, I would suggest them to get some help, and they could sign up for our program if they that feels like a good fit. But family, loved ones, definitely have can take some active steps as well. So definitely look that one up, that blog post. Okay, I hope I explained it a little more. Um, Someone asked, how do you let their OCD behavior become extinct without triggering their fear? So the idea isn't to avoid triggering the fear. We want to bring the fear up. We want to expose ourselves to the emotion. We're not just exposing ourselves to the trigger. We're exposing ourselves to the distressing emotion and teaching our brains that it's not dangerous to be with that emotion. That's really the deeper work of ERP. Does that make sense? Are there any more questions? Okay, if there's no more questions, then we'll close the chat. And again, if you have any more questions, you can send me an email at maya@helpingminds.com. And thank you everyone for joining today. I hope you have a great day.